Hi, am I audible? Okay. Welcome all to today's tutorial session for the sixth week of lectures of Animal Physiology, the course taken by Professor Mainak Das on NPTEL. I am Geetika Agarwal. I am a PhD student in Center for Ecological Sciences in IISc Bangalore. So, today we'll be discussing what was covered in sixth week and some of the quiz questions. And So let's keep this interactive. If you have any doubts, kindly let me know and you can stop me in between and ask your doubts, any if you have. Okay. So the topics that were mostly covered in this week included how signals that are passed in the neurons, in the mesh of neurons, in the network of neurons, they are spatially and temporally follow a summation of sorts. So spatially and temporally how the signals travel, they get summed up, and that is how they move forward. And then we looked at the hippocampus and the anatomy of the hippocampus. Then we studied a bit about epilepsy and how the memory gets formed, and two of these models of memory formation, which is long term potentiation and long term depression. So, starting off to signal propagation in the brain. So, what we see here is that we have these two types of neurons. One of them passes on excitatory signals. It gives out excitatory neurotransmitters, and the inhibitory neuron releases the inhibitory neurotransmitters. So here you can say that this excitatory neuron will in turn excite the postsynaptic neuron, which means that it will send a positive signal, which will lead the postsynaptic neuron to produce an action potential, right? And the inhibitory neuron, in the same sense, will send a negative signal to the postsynaptic neuron, stopping it or inhibiting it from um, creating an action potential, from releasing an action potential. So, what actually passes on in the postsynaptic neuron is a summation of the both, plus 20 minus 5. So, the signal that will travel on will have a lesser amount of strength. The signal that will travel on will be less strong than the excitatory signal that was coming from the blue colored neuron because of the inhibition from the other neuron. So signals work in an additive fashion. If there is an excitable neuron and it is sending a positive signal, and at the same time there is an inhibitory neuron which is sending a negative signal, then the postsynaptic neuron, as shown here, it will what will allow it to go forward from it is the summation of the two signals that are coming from the presynaptic neurons. Okay. I hope this is clear to everybody and why we are calling it a summation rule, or how signals get spatially and temporally transmitted onwards. Okay, moving on to what is an OTAPS. Can you guys tell me what is an OTAPS? This is a term that was introduced in this week of lectures, and so I hope you are all aware of what an OTAPS mean, or if you can guess it from the term. So you can either type it out in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and tell me the answer. If you know, what does it mean by an OTAPS? Automatic. Okay, automatic what? And anyone else would like to take a guess at this? Enzymes or hormones? Okay, that's not really what I'm looking for. So think of something that matches the term OTAPS, which is found in the context of the nervous system and in the context of the neurons. Chemical signals. Okay. Anyone else? What does it mean by an OTAPS? Like, what is an OTAPS? Okay, so if nobody wants to take a guess other than Bhagya and Ashwarya, I'll tell you the answer. An autoapse is basically a synapse of a neuron on itself. So when a neuron, when it is sending a signal to itself, the synapse of the axon of that neuron to its own dendrites is called an autoapse. As you can see in this image, basically one of the axonal terminal here is synapsing with the dendritic terminals. It's also called an autosynapse or a self synapse, which means that a part of the signal that the neuron is supposed to pass on comes back to the same neuron. So I hope this is clear what is an autoapse. It's basically the synapse of a neuron with itself. Okay, moving on to hyperexcitability. So hyperexcitability is basically a phenomena. So here in this diagram, you can see that we have a sender neuron, or you can say a presynaptic neuron, and you have a postsynaptic or a receiver neuron R. So say the sender sends on a signal at a time t1, and the receiver gets it at a time delay of t2, because there is a gap between the releasing of the neurotransmitters and them reaching the dendritic ends of the, what is a synapse? Hi, so synapse is basically, so when there are two neurons, they're not connected end to end with each other. There is a gap between two neurons, and that gap is called a synapse. So a neuron, if you know, if you have seen the diagram of a neuron, basically there's a cell body. From the cell body, certain branches they extend out. One of this is a longer branch which is called an axon, and the other shorter ones are called the dendrites. I hope that much is clear. So, mostly how neurons are connected is that the axon of one neuron, which is called presynaptic, comes in and it is very closely placed to the dendrites of the next neuron, but they are not physically connected. There is a gap between both the neurons, and that gap is called the synapse or the synaptic cleft. And that is why when a signal travels through a neuron, it does not travel continuously, but when it hits that gap, it travels with the help of neurotransmitters, which are some chemicals that are released by one neuron, and they are taken up by the next one, and that is how the signal travels in the nervous system. Okay, is that clear, Bhagyalakshmi? Okay. So here, what I was saying about hyperexcitability is that, say the neuron S, it sends out a signal at T1, but neuron R receives it at T2, because there's of course a time gap between when the neurotransmitters get released from S and when they reach the dendrites of R. So in the time T2 minus T1, these neurotransmitters should be there in the synaptic cleft for them to be picked up by R. But if they stay in that synaptic cleft for a time longer than T2 minus T1, then the postsynaptic neuron, which is R in this case, it keeps getting the signal. So even if S is no longer sending a signal, R will still keep getting and picking up these neurotransmitters, and that is what makes R hyperexcitable. And hyperexcitability can be defined as the increased likelihood that a neuron will be activated by a certain stimulus. So basically, this can result in the neuron firing action potentials more frequently, even in response to a smaller stimuli. So the stimuli that S was sending on to R was a small stimuli, but since these neurotransmitters, they were there in the synaptic cleft and they stayed there for longer than required. Now R is more predisposed to firing off more and more action potentials, because it can keep on picking up these neurotransmitters, which will open subsequent channels, which will lead to action potentials. Yes, Ashwarya, tell me. Do you have a question? Okay. So basically, what is happening in hyperexcitability is, uh, so there are, for example, there are two neurons. So you aware of what is a presynaptic neuron, what is a postsynaptic neuron? Are you okay with these terms? Yes. Okay. So there is a presynaptic neuron, there is a postsynaptic neuron, and you know that when a presynaptic neuron is sending on a signal, then what happens at the axonal end is that it releases neurotransmitters, right? And then these neurotransmitters, they stay in the synaptic cleft, and then later they go on and attach to the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron, where they open certain channels, sodium channels, which pick up sodium, and then that leads to an action potential in the postsynaptic neuron, right? You're aware of this signal propagation between and how it happens across the synapse. Yes. Okay. So what happens in hyperexcitability is that कि जो ये neurotransmitters that are coming into the synaptic cleft, right? They should stay there only for a certain period of time. But if they stay there longer than that, then what will happen? You can imagine. Then more of these will keep attaching themselves to these channels, and more sodium channels will keep opening, and this will lead to increased amount of depolarization of R, which means more and more action potentials being fired by R, which was not happening in the earlier case, because after a certain period of time, these neurotransmitters were getting either dispersed or they were getting broken down, right? So in the case of hyperexcitability, they persist there in that synaptic cleft, and they keep stimulating R, which makes it fire more and more action potentials than required, and that is why R is now said to be a hyperexcitable neuron. Okay, cool. So this is all about hyperexcitability, and this has some interesting consequences in the human body, which we will come to later. Moving on to the hippocampus. So, you might be aware of hippocampus, amygdala. These are some terms you are mostly introduced to in the high school. And we know that hippocampus, so it is located in the temporal lobe of the brain. So, brain has these different lobes, like the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe, these things, right? So, it is located in the temporal lobe. And you can see in this diagram, it looks like this. It has some of these gyrations, and it is a layered structure, and most of the neurons that make up the hippocampus are either pyramidal neurons because their cell body is shaped like a pyramid, or they are interneurons which connect these pyramidal neurons. Okay. So these are the two types of neurons that are mostly found in the hippocampus. And to provide a little bit of background, is that the hippocampus is a small brain structure, but as you might already know, it has a very important role in learning and in the formation of memory. So it plays a very significant role in memory formation and how we learn things, how we maintain that memory in our brain. And a part of the hippocampus is also called the dentate gyrus, and we'll come to it in the next slide. But another things that hippocampus is responsible for is long-term formation of memory and the retrieval of this memory. So long-term memory, like you remember things from your past, from your childhood, these memories are stored in the hippocampus, and they also get retrieved from the hippocampus. And another thing that it plays a role is in spatial memory. So when you walk from your home to your school, or from your home to your college, you know the paths. You don't every day, you don't have to open up Google Maps and find the way to that place, right? Or even if you're in a new city, you might have to open up maps to find a place, but eventually, after 1 or 2 days, you will memorize that path and you will know where you're going. So it is the hippocampus that plays a role in you remembering this spatial, this space around you and where things are located. So it has a very important role in these things. And the dentate gyrus is a part of the hippocampus which is located nearby. So this one that you can see here, basically with these ridges, this is the dentate gyrus. And as I said, hippocampus is a layered structure. So the neurons here are placed in a layered fashion. Okay, and if you look at it under a microscope, it looks something like this. No, the hypothalamus and the hippocampus are not the same. Hypothalamus is a different thing. That is what mostly controls a lot of hormones and a lot of our temperature regulation. But hippocampus is the center which helps with learning and memory. Okay, these are two separate things, two separate zones in the brain. Okay. Okay. So here you can see this is the CA1, which is here also marked as CA1. So the neurons here are arranged in a layered fashion. Then CA1 comes on and it's connected to the CA3, and here is the dentate gyrus. So this is how these different structures basically are located in the hippocampus. Again, you can see it in this in this other microscopic image that here is the CA1, this is where it's starting, this is where it connects to CA3, and this is where the dentate gyrus starts. So this is how these organs are basically positioned in the brain. And neurons mostly in the dentate gyrus, they are non-pyramidal. As we discussed in the hippocampus, we have pyramidal neurons, which means the cell body is shaped like a pyramid. But in the dentate gyrus, the neurons are non-pyramidal, and it is the seat for the brain's stem cells. So it's not really clear whether this place helps in the repair of a brain, or whether it helps to, repair neurons that have been injured. But it's we just know that this place has the stem cells or the brain's progenitor cells. Okay, so this is all about the dentate gyrus. Moving on, two types of neurons in the hippocampus. As I said, we have pyramidal neurons and interneurons, but there are some different types of neurotransmitters that are majorly released in the hippocampus. So, can you guys name some of these neurotransmitters that are typically released in the hippocampus, or the neurons, the type of neurons which release these different neurotransmitters? Are you guys aware of any of this? What are the three major neurotransmitters that are released in the hippocampus? Anyone? Okay. So the three major ones are, so we have one are glutamatergic neurons. Basically, they secrete this excitatory neurotransmitter, which is also called, which is glutamate or glutamic acid. Excitatory neurotransmitters, as I explained, they're basically the neurotransmitters that lead to the postsynaptic neuron being excited. And that is, they start firing action potentials, right? And so one of the type of neurons is glutamatergic, other one is GABAergic neurons. So putting this term ergic behind the neurotransmitter tells you the type of neuron which releases that neurotransmitter. So GABAergic neurons, they secrete GABA, which is a major inhibitory neurotransmitter. And inhibitory means that it prevents the postsynaptic neuron from firing action potentials. And the last one, which is debated whether these are found or not in the hippocampus, but there is some evidence that some of these neurons also form a part of the hippocampus, are the cholinergic neurons, which secrete the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Okay, so these are the three major type of neurons that are found in the hippocampus: glutamatergic, GABAergic, and cholinergic. And the last one, as I said, are interneurons, which are non-pyramidal, and they can also secrete any of these three types of neurotransmitters. So these interneurons can either be glutamatergic, GABAergic, or cholinergic. Okay. So moving on to epilepsy. Is anybody here aware of what is the term epilepsy, or what does it mean? Or have you ever heard? Yes, Ashwarya. Previous slide. Yeah. Do you have a question, or do you want to just read it out? Because these slides will be shared with you, so you can basically refer to them as and when you require. Okay, cool. So, yeah, I was asking, is anybody aware of what is epilepsy, or have you heard of this term? No. Others? Involuntary movement. Okay. Okay. So, basically, epilepsy is a disorder, excitatory brain damage, right? So it's basically a disorder which is caused by the hyperexcitability of neurons. And we've discussed earlier only what is hyperexcitability is when a neuron receives a signal more than what it should, and then it fires action potentials more than it should in a normal condition. So, epilepsy is mostly caused by the hyperexcitability of neurons. And for a very small amount of time, or for a transient period of time, there is so much activity in that neuron, in the neurons of our brain, that those individuals, they lose consciousness and they mostly get these seizures, which are called epileptic seizures, where, as you said, they have this involuntary movement, or this shaking movement. And during epilepsy, what happens is that there is a small locus that might get very hyper excitable, and the neurons in these locuses, they secrete large amount of neurotransmitters. So they release neurotransmitters in quantities that are more than required, and they might, and why they do so is, we don't yet know why this happens or why these neurons secrete more neurotransmitters than required. But some of these neurons are genetically predisposed to do so. So this might have a genetic element to it, of why some people have epilepsy, or it might be due to some brain injury. So it is basically a disorder which is caused by the hyperexcitability of neurons. Okay. And so there was this patient back in 1953. So his name was Henry Molaison. He was also very famously called Patient HM to save his identity, and that is how patients were referred to in the hospital. So what happened to this guy was that he had epilepsy, and for a long time, till he was 27 years old, he was suffering with very severe seizures. So he didn't have like short seizures. He was suffering with severe, like long, say 5 minute seizures and things like that. And it was a severe case of epilepsy. And he could not, even keep a job because of all of this. So what happened was he went to the hospital, and then surgeons told him that, okay, fine, we might have to do this experimental surgery on you because epilepsy is not yet studied so much, but um we'll get to know better about it and we might do this thing. And he said, okay, fine. And he allowed the surgeons to remove a small section from his, a small tissue from each side of his brain. And this was an experimental procedure, as I said, and they hoped that this will stop um his seizures. And you can see in this image, so the normal brain, it has hippocampus on both the sides, on the left and the right hemisphere of the brain. And so what happened in his case is that they removed this section, because the it is the hippocampal neurons that are known to be hyperexcitable, and that lead to basically epilepsy. So they basically removed these two sections, that okay, fine, we'll remove the cause of the thing. If there's no tissue with hyperexcitable neurons, there'll be no epilepsy, and they were correct in this. So the seizures stopped. But what happened after it was that Molaison had permanent amnesia. And what that means is that he could not form new memories. So he still remembered old things. He remembered facts from his childhood. He remembered things about his parents or things that happened before the surgery, but he was not able to form new memories. So, for example, if somebody would come and meet him and then go away, he would not remember them the next moment, that, okay, who was this or what happened. So, these small things, he could not really remember anything from that point on in his life. So this led the doctors to figure out that, oh, okay, fine. It is the hippocampus that plays. So till then, people had no idea about how memory is being formed in the brain. What is the part of the brain that is actually controlling all these things? So this is always not known, and there was no research, or there was ongoing research, but people didn't know the answer to what part of the brain is actually responsible for formation of memory, for storage of memory, and all these things. So once this happened, once the case of HM happened, these doctors or the neurologists, they then knew that, okay, hippocampus plays a very important role in the formation of memory. And since then they started doing a lot of this research which was hippocampal centric, and that is how they figured out how it plays an important role in the formation of these memories, in the formation of long term and short term memories and spatial memories and all of these things. Okay, and talking about memory, then came these two models. One is long-term potentiation, and one is long-term depression. And long-term potentiation was the model which was also proposed by Hebb. Um, so Donald Hebb, and that's why it's called the Hebbian learning model. So what happens in this case is, so Donald Hebb, he gave this model in 1940s, the Hebbian learning model, and as I said, it's also the long-term potentiation model of the neurons. What happens in this is that he talks about how the neurons they adapt and then they form stronger connections after repeated use. So as you might have noticed that if any of you would go to the gym and you repeatedly use your muscles, say you're repeatedly picking up dumbbells, then you're using your biceps and triceps, and then you might be able to get stronger biceps and triceps. So in the same way, he said that okay, the neurons that are being repeatedly used, the strength will be better, the connections will be better between those neurons. And each time you think about that memory again and again, so say each time you try and do something, so the memory of that will come back to you. And each time the action is repeated, then the neural pathways that are involved in it, they become more and more strong and they become robust because they keep on firing action potentials together, and that memory becomes more intuitive and it becomes easy to reproduce. So just imagine yourself trying to learn how to skate. So in the beginning you might not be able to know how to skate, how you're going to balance yourself and all that, but eventually you learn it. And if you keep on doing it again and again, if you keep on repeating that process, then you will eventually, it will become intuitive to you and you will not have to think anymore, and you will just be able to skate around. Or say the same thing, if somebody is learning a piano, initially he would have to learn, he would have to teach his fingers how to move and learn how these different, what are these different chords, how do they sound, all of this. But eventually with enough repetition, it will, like they say, they will know it by heart. It actually means that it will get, it'll get into their brain in a way that it'll become like it'll just flow and they will remember this, they'll not forget it. So that is long term potentiation. Basically you can see in this diagram, if this is the normal neuron, in the normal case, though what is happening, it's getting excited and action potential is being fired. But here after repeated use, it will get potentiated, which means this connection will get stronger and stronger between these two neurons. More neurotransmitters will be released and higher number of action potentials will be fired when you're trying to recall the same thing again and again. So this is the LTP model, long-term potentiation. So say at time t1, again you have these two neurons, the sender and the receiver neuron, and the sender is sending the signal, and the receiver is receiving it. Now at time t2, what is happening is the sender has stopped sending the receiver any signal of any sort, but the receiver is still receiving it is still processing the signal. Okay. For example, you're trying to read or learn something from a book. So when the book is open in front of your eyes, you're reading it. That time the signal is going to your brain and you're actively receiving the signal of what you're reading in the book. But once you close the book and you're trying to recall what you read, that is the time is when you're not getting a signal anymore, but you're still processing the signal that you received earlier. So, okay, in that way, you can think about how long term potentiation works. So, you're still processing the thing that you read about earlier. So, same way, the receiver neuron is still processing the signal that it had received earlier. Okay, so this is one of the two models of memory formation, and the opposite of long term potentiation. So, okay, one another thing is, why does this happen? So there are two basic reasons that are mostly thought of why the receiver is doing so or what happened to the receiver is that either the receiving neuron has faced some change in its electrical status. So that is why it keeps firing these action potentials again and again, even if it is not getting a signal anymore from the sender. So either there is some change in the electrical status of R, or it is retro messaging, which means that one of the axonal terminals from R is going back to S and telling it to send more signals towards R. So these are the two things that are thought of as reasons for long-term potentiation or as reasons for why this happens. Okay. So the last thing for today is long-term depression model, which I said is the opposite of long-term potentiation model. So what happens here is that it is characterized by a decrease in the postsynaptic strength. So in the earlier one, we said the more and more we keep using those neurons, the more and more the connection gets strengthened. But here, what is happening is that they're talking about a decrease in the postsynaptic strength. And according to this model, some parts of the brain they become hyperexcitable even at a very low frequency stimuli. So you're not giving a strong stimuli, you're giving a very low frequency stimuli, but even still the brain is getting hyper excitable, and you can still remember those things even with a small stimuli. So this plays an important role in emotional memories, in fear-based memories, and in memories that are related to your routine activities, like brushing your teeth, like riding a bicycle, like walking. So motor learning and spatial memory, that mostly happens by, or is thought to happen, is believed to happen by the long-term depression model. So you don't need to have a very strong stimulus for you to remember again and again how are you going to ride a bicycle or how are you going to walk. So a very small stimulus of you just thinking that okay, I'm going to ride this bicycle is going to help you ride it, right? So that is what basically means by long-term depression, that a small stimuli can lead to the hyperexcitability of some neurons in the brain, and it is the opposite of the long-term potentiation. So both of these are forms of synaptic plasticity, which means that both of these models, they talk about some sort of a change that is happening at the synapse. In some way the dendrites or the are getting changed, are getting altered at the synapse. Either they are getting more branched. When we're talking about potentiation, they're getting there is an increased number of connection at that synapse. There are more branches of the dendrites and more branches of the axons, or their shape is getting altered. So that is what is synaptic plasticity, and both of these models are forms of synaptic plasticity. That is, they talk about how things are getting changed at the synapse for memory to be formed. Okay, so this was all about today, and now we'll discuss some of the questions that I have for you guys. And if you guys have any doubts, you can ask me, or you can ask me after the class as well. So moving on to the questions and answers of today. So oligodendrocytes are what? Are they myelinating cells in the central nervous system, in the peripheral nervous system, in both the central and the peripheral nervous system? Or are these electrically active non-myelinating cells? So Sushri says it's A, that is, they're myelinating cells in the central nervous system. Okay, correct. So basically, these are myelinating cells. Oligodendrocytes are the myelinating cells in the central nervous system. Cell bodies of efferent neurons are in dash. So if you guys remember what are efferent neurons, so there are two terms, afferent and efferent neurons. So cell bodies of the efferent neurons are in what? Central nervous system or in the peripheral nervous system? So you say it's the peripheral nervous system, and that is actually the incorrect answer. The cell bodies of the efferent neurons are in the central nervous system. So efferent neurons are the ones that send the signal from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system, right? From the brain to the effector muscles. So that is why their cell bodies would be in the central nervous system, from where they then send the signals through the axons towards the extremities of the body. Okay, so the answer to this question is the central nervous system. Signal travels within the neuron dash and between two neurons dash. So how does a signal travel between the neurons and within the neurons? So yes, the correct answer is basically electrically and chemically. So so within the neuron, the signal is traveling electrically, but when we talk about between the neurons, since there is a synaptic cleft, it is passed on by neurotransmitters, and that is a chemical transmission. Schwann cells are what? Are they myelinating cells in the central nervous system, in the peripheral nervous system, or in both? So you're correct. Basically, Schwann cells are the myelinating cells in the peripheral nervous system. So oligodendrocytes are the myelinating cells in the central nervous system, and Schwann cells are the ones in the peripheral nervous system. So they myelinate the peripheral nerves, and they serve to be the primary glial cells in the peripheral nervous system. The longest process of a neuron is called what? So this is a pretty simple question. What is the longest process of the neuron called? Correct. So it's an axon. Efferent neurons, which are also called motor neurons, which means that they send signals from the brain to the effector muscles, They are the nerve fibers responsible for carrying signals from dash in order to initiate an action. Oh, I already gave the answer away. Yeah, so they basically carry the signals from the brain to the peripheral nervous system. Correct. Next question. What is an inhibitory signal? An inhibitory signal between two neurons is what? So, what is an inhibitory signal? Does it increase the intensity of action potential by tenfold, decrease it by tenfold, or decrease the probability of generation of action potential in presynaptic neuron, or decrease it in the postsynaptic neuron? So the correct answer to this question is D. It decreases the probability of generation of action potential in the postsynaptic neuron. That is the neuron that is receiving the signal. Okay. An excitatory signal. So same thing. What does an excitatory signal do? I think this is a pretty simple question. Okay, you're saying A, it increases the intensity of action potential by tenfold. Anyone else? Anybody would like to take a guess at this question? Okay, C part. Anyone? So, an excitatory signal between two neurons, does it increase the intensity of action potential by tenfold, decrease the intensity of action potential by tenfold, increase the probability of generation of action potential in the postsynaptic neuron, or decrease the probability of generation of action potential in the presynaptic neuron? C. So that is correct. Basically, it's the opposite of the inhibitory signal. It just increases the probability of generation of action potential in the postsynaptic neuron. Moving on to cell bodies of afferent neurons are in what part of the nervous system? Now, we're not talking about the efferent neurons, we're talking about the afferent neurons. So the correct answer to this question is the peripheral nervous system. So the cell bodies of the efferent neurons, which means the neurons that carry signals from brain to the peripheral nervous system, those cell bodies are in the central nervous system, but of afferent neurons, which carry signals from the peripheral sites towards the brain, will have cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, because the signal travels from the neuron receives a signal from the dendrites and it travels to the axon. So basically, if the signal is coming from the peripheral to the central nervous system, then the cell bodies will be in the peripheral nervous system. I hope that is clear. Moving on to next question. The conduction speed in neuron dash with effective myelination. What happens to the conduction speed of neuron with effective myelination? Increase, decrease, is unaffected, or it cannot be calculated. So yes, the correct part is the correct answer is does it increases. The conduction speed increases if there is effective myelination. Because myelination is like wire insulation and it increases the conduction speed. Which neurotransmitter is most often associated with inhibitory action in the brain that might be relevant to epilepsy? So, which of these neurotransmitters is most often associated with inhibitory action in the brain? Yeah, so the correct answer is C. GABA is a major inhibitory neuron and it also plays an important role in epilepsy. What is epilepsy? B. Correct. It's a chronic neurological disorder which is characterized by recurrent seizures. Which part of the brain is commonly associated with these focal seizures of epilepsy? Okay, you say it's parietal, temporal. Anyone else would like to take a guess? So we've got all the three guesses. We've got one person saying B, and then C, and then D. Somebody, anybody else? So the answer to this question is actually C, the temporal lobe, because as we discussed that the hippocampus is actually present in the temporal lobe, and it is the hippocampal neurons that mostly get hyperexcited and that lead to these epileptic seizures. Okay, so remember it. It's the hippocampus, and hippocampus is present in the temporal lobe. Which of the following is an example of motor learning that involves LTD? Okay, memorizing a list of words. You're talking about motor learning. Only one of these is an example of a motor form of learning. Yeah. So the correct answer is basically learning how to ride a bicycle, because that is a motor task which we do. Memorizing a list of words, understanding mathematical, all of these have nothing to do with the motor part of our body. We're not using our limbs for that. So motor learning is learning to ride a bicycle. What is long-term potentiation? Correct. It's the B part, which is it is the process that increases synaptic strength after having a high frequency stimulation. LTP and LTD are examples of what type of a neural process? Correct. So basically, as I said before, they are types of synaptic plasticity. Which neurotransmitter is most closely associated with LTP? Which of these neurotransmitters plays an important role in long term potentiation? Correct. So the correct part is glutamate, because glutamate is one of those excitatory neurotransmitters that plays a very important role in the long term potentiation. LTD is often important for which of the following? This might be a little tricky for you guys, but okay, just take a guess. LTD is often important for which of the following? Is it important to learn new information, forgetting or weakening of less important information, enhancing emotional responses, or increasing neurogenesis? Okay, there's a guess of B, there's a guess of A. Anyone else? So the correct answer of this is B part, which is basically forgetting or weakening of less important information. So one another important thing that LTD plays a role in is that it basically makes those synapses a little weaker, which are not being used a lot, because that will give you space to store new memory. So, like in a memory card, unless you remove old unimportant files, you don't have enough space to store new files. In a similar way, in our brain also, LTD does this work of purging out memories that are no longer important to you. Okay. Say for example, there was a phone number that you once remembered, but now nobody has that number, and you don't really need to keep that in your brain. So eventually, you'll see that that memory does not really stay in your brain; it just gets removed from your brain, and that is what LTD is playing an important role in. So it is removing all these old memories that are not really important now for you. So forgetting or weakening of less important information. Which part of the brain is primarily involved in LTD related to motor learning? So, which part of the brain is primarily involved in motor learning? Hippocampus. Okay, a lot of you are saying hippocampus, but the correct answer to this question is actually the cerebellum, because we're talking about motor learning here. So, what we talked about earlier was LTP, where we were forming new memories like remembering faces or remembering events, things like that. And that is what LTP plays an important role in, and that is what happens mostly in the hippocampus. But motor learning is one part that happens in the cerebellum actually. So the LTD that is happening in the cerebellum is what leads to a lot of this motor learning skills that we gain. So keep that in mind now. And the next question is, what is the main effect of LTP on synaptic connections? So how does LTP affect our synaptic connections? We're talking about LTP and not LTD. So talking about potentiation. Yeah. So the correct answer is basically strengthening of synaptic connections. As we discussed, long-term potentiation talks about how when neurons keep getting signal for the same thing, the strength of their synaptic connections is enhanced. So during synaptic plasticity, dendritic spines they undergo a lot of change in their number and in their shape, as I was talking about earlier, and it leads to the formation and stabilization of new spines and the enlargement of the spine heads. So LTP does that because it is strengthening the connection between these two neurons. LTD, on the opposite hand, when we're trying to remove our old memories or something we don't require anymore, it causes these spines to actually shrink and retract. Okay, moving on. So, which cellular structure is primarily involved in synaptic plasticity, such as LTP and LTD? Myelin sheath. Okay. Anybody else? Correct. I just discussed this in the previous slide. We were talking about dendrites and dendritic spines. So, the cellular structure that is primarily involved in synaptic plasticity of LTP and LTD is actually the dendrites. And they are what undergo this change. So I think coming on to the last question, long term depression is defined as what? So we've discussed a lot about this now. Correct. So basically, all of you know this by now. Long term depression is the decrease in synaptic strength due to low frequency or following a low frequency stimulation. Correct. Last question. Which brain region is commonly associated with LTP? I just gave you the answer when we were talking about LTD. Correct. So the answer to this question is the hippocampus. So, thank you for joining the session. These were all the questions that I had for you for today. Please keep these in mind. The presentation will be shared with you. If any of you have any doubts or any questions, you can stay on and ask me your questions. Otherwise, you can leave the meeting. We're done for the day. People having any more doubts can ask me. Thank you. My LinkedIn ID. Okay. Okay, I'll add it at the end of this slide only, maybe, because I'll have to go to my LinkedIn to check. Okay, anybody else? If you guys have no questions, I will end the meeting for today. Thank you for joining.